How's it going, YouTube? It's Alex. I'm back here with part 4 of our networking series, multiplayer game in Unity using Node.js. Today we're going to focus on some aiming with a little touchbacks. We're going to be adding some art as well. So we're going to be touching back a little bit on the movement code just to do a little bit of tweaks to kind of fit the art style that I'm going to apply. So the first thing you're going to want to do is, I'm going to put the link in the description, but we're going to use some assets courtesy of Kenny here, and they're free to use in any game project, personal or commercial. So thank you, Kenny. Make sure you go thank him on Twitter at Kenny, all that jazz. And then you're just going to hit download, and we're going to put this in our folder. So I'm going to go to Unity Shooter, and I'm just going to put assets, and I'm going to save it right there. Okay, cool. And then I'm just going to hit extract too. And what I like to do is I like to extract stuff. You'll notice I didn't put it in the actual assets folders. I put it in a underscore assets that was there. And I do that because I don't need like all the assets. So after you do that, you can just close it out. And I'm just going to bring up Windows here. Go down to my folder. So like what I was saying was you have an underscore assets. I created this folder just to store assets, and this was something from another area. So we're going to go into PNG and then go into Retina. And I'm just going to drag this off to the side, and we're going to go into our Unity project. So in our Unity project, if you just left click assets and then right click to create and then folder, we're going to create a folder called art. And what we're going to do is we're going to right click on art and do show and explore. So now you'll have these two folders open. If you just go into the art folder, we can do on our left hand window here, you can do a Control A, or you can just do select, shift, the first one, select the last one of your choice. Just select them all, and then just drag and drop, and it'll copy over. And make sure you actually you copy those. Oh my! Don't just drag them over. Make sure you copy them, so you get both of them. Okay, cool. And then if you close that out, Unity's going to import all this. Cool. So you're going to select select the first one, and then just go down to the last one, and you're going to hold down Shift, and then left select again to highlight them all. We're going to change this to pixel per unit. We're going to go to 128. So the reason why they're 128 is because we have some tiles for the ground that are 128, and it'll just make everything a nice scale to that if one Unity square here, one Unity unit is one of these tiles exactly. And then I'm going to just switch this to 256 and make sure it's on single and hit apply. Cool. So we're not going to be using the whole pack here. We're only going to be using a couple elements of the pack, and then in future tutorials we're going to be using other parts of the pack. So this does take a second. There we go. Beautiful. Okay, so now those all have our correct import settings. If you don't do that setting, then you might run into issues in the future. So just make sure that we do those settings. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go down, and we're going to close this folder here on the left. We'll close up the code, and we're going to open prefab, and then just drag and drop the player prefab. So what we're going to do is we're going to do some editing to the player prefab to get them ready for what we're going to do. So the art asset is, if you didn't notice from before, is tanks. So one thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be changing the movement to be more like a tank, and we're going to be adding functionality to look at more to make it look more like a tank as well. So right now we have a circle. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the sprite. I'm going to hit F2 to rename it. I'm going to call it tank. I'm going to come over to the sprite itself, and I'm going to change it to tank body underscore big red. And I'm going to use the outlined version. Now this is up to you which one you use in the future. We could swap them in and out. It doesn't really matter. Just I'm going to use the red one because it was a little bit easier to see which way the front was when you're turning. The next thing we're going to do is you're going to left click on the player prefab. You're going to right click and you're going to create empty. And you're going to call this barrel pivot. So the art assets, if you click on the tank, for example, the pivot is in the center. You're going to notice that with the barrel, but the barrel has to rotate on one end. So we're going to make just an empty game object for the barrel to sit into. And then I like to just Control D to duplicate the tank. And I'm going to drag it inside the barrel pivot. And I'm going to rename this to the barrel. I'm going to come over and change this to special barrel 1 and the outline. And you're going to notice that we get some issues here where things are, the barrel should be on top. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into where it says sorting layer and we're going to hit add sorting layer. So we're going to add some for the future. We're only going to be using one right now, but when you start adding in ground and stuff, we're going to start adding those in. So default is the bottommost layer. So think of it the farthest back, and everything you add after that is in front of it. So we're going to add one called ground, one called decoration, one for player, one for decorations above player. So that could be maybe the bullet or something. And then one for user interface. And this could be in-game user interface. It might follow the tank, for example. So if we go back to tank, we're going to set its sorting layer to player. You can leave it at 0. And we're going to set the barrel to also player, but set order in the layer to 1. And just like the sorting layer, where top down in that list was the furthest back to the front, 0 is the furthest back to 100 per se, or whatever the number supports. I think it's probably 4 digits. It's probably a lot. Okay, and then the last thing that I'm going to add is I'm going to add, and this is more for fun, I'm going to left click the prefab. I'm going to go down to effects and I'm going to add a trail. Yay, trail. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of the trail, we're going to go to the assets, we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call it materials. Okay. And then we're going to go inside materials, and we're going to create material, and we're going to call this tank trail. So if you have left-clicked tank trail, we're going to change the shader to particles and then alpha blended pre-multiply. And if you go to the trail itself and you click materials here, and then you go to the default line and just click on the little window to select a new one, you'll notice that there's the default line here, and if you double click inside of it, you'll see that the shader they use is the alpha blended pre-multiply. So that's why we're going to use that one. And now we need a texture. So we're going to go into here, we're going to type in track. So one of the things came with track is double. The issue with this, I'm not going to show you, but basically we have to rotate the image sideways, otherwise we'll get the tracks looking in a weird direction. So if you go into art and you go down to tracks double, left click and then right click and go to show and explore, we're just going to right click that and we're going to hit rotate right. Okay, cool. Then you can close that and Unity's going to import it, and you'll see in the bottom right here, even though it's faded, it does rotate to the right. And there's no way to like do it inside Unity, so it's just easier to do it this way, and you'll see it changes here. Okay, so if you go back into your trail itself, we're going to change a couple things. We're going to change the size to 0.5, and these are all things. Sorry, that was the materials. You can change the time to 0.5. Sorry. And then you're going to right click this little diamond here, and you're going to hit edit key, and you're going to change that to 0.75. So what this is we're going to change the time. That's the time that it trails behind. So it's like a nice little trail. And then the width is 0.75 of the whole sprite. So this will look like it's where the track should be. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to change it from stretch to tile. So just how the texture is laid out along this piece of geometry that it's creating. And then we're all good to go. So you'll notice here that the prefab, the rest of the new stuff we just added is not blue. So make sure you left click player prefab and you hit apply. And then it should go blue. And if you open up the one in the assets folder, you'll notice that they're all right there as well. Okay. Yay! So if I close this up and I go into the server here and I say nodemon start to start our server. Let's close out these. Okay, so the server's started, and if I go into here, we have our tank, and as we go forward, you'll see the little line, but the texture isn't quite working. But you can see us moving around, and what we did with the dot before with the movement, it doesn't really work for a tank. So what we're going to do is we're going to have horizontal keys rotate the tank, and then you move forward and back based on the vector that the tank is facing. Okay, so let's fix the trail. So the one thing we forgot to do is if you go into materials, you'll notice that's still default line. Make sure you drag and drop, or you could use the little selection on here to add in tank trail. So now if we click play, you'll notice we get a tank trail. Okay. And if you look, it kind of follows behind the player. We'll just change this to 0.25 and see what that's like. Okay, so if I open this guy up and I go into 2.5, okay, so we get a nice little textured version of our thing. And this is just to help with the direction, again, that the player is facing. So we changed it there. Just make sure you go into the prefab trail and then change time to 0.25. Okay. So now we're gonna work on doing some aiming as the goal of the tutorial. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to redrag the player prefab back in. We're going to open up code. And we're going to open up our player manager. So that's under code, player manager, and then player manager. And we're going to start mocking out our rotation stuff. So just like before, just to make it simplistic, we're going to keep kind of our controls in this class. Normally, if you want to expand, you would kind of separate this all out. So the first thing we're going to do is based on the direction that our assets are facing, we have to actually add an offset. So I'm going to make a constant float called barrel pivot offset. And I'm going to set this to 90. And if you end up replacing with different assets, this number could be 0, this number could be whatever. It's kind of just a number to get it back to looking at the mouse. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a rotational speed for the tank itself. So we're going to say float, and then we're going to put in rotation. And this I found worked good at 60. So we're going to be doing that, and I'm actually going to change this speed down to 2. And we'll make sure we change the player prefab as well. So if I come back over to here, the player prefab should stay 4 on speed. I'm actually going to change this to 2, and then make sure the rotation is 60. You're welcome to play with those values. That's just what I found looked kind of nice. Yay. Okay, so we need some reference to something, so we're going to create a new header, and this will be our stuff for our object references. And I like to separate everything out in headers. You don't have to, it's totally up to you. And we're going to call this a transform. So we only need the transform, which is positional and rotational data, for the barrel pivot. Okay, we don't need to mess with the graphic, we're just messing with the pivot, and because it's a child of the pivot, it'll rotate. Okay, and our last variable we're going to add before we go is one called last rotation. This has to do with updating the networking version of this rotational value. Okay. So we're going to have, just like the check movement, we're going to make a function called check aiming. Cool. And we're going to call this with the movement as well. And inside here, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to grab the mouse position. So we're going to say vector3 mouse position is equal to camera dot main screen to world point. Screen to world point. And we're going to say input dot mouse position. So what this does is the mouse position comes as a vector3 that's like located on your screen. So as I move my mouse around, right, it would be like 0, 0, and then whatever the 1920 is. And then what it's doing is it's taking the camera, and the camera has, it's rectangle, the screen, and it's transferring that point into a 3D space. So this is going to give our mouse position that's in 3D space. And what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the difference between the mouse position and the current position of our object. So what that's going to do is if our mouse position is at check aiming up here and our tank is in the middle of the screen, it'll give us a nice vector that goes from the middle to check aiming. And this is very handy for calculating the direction that the barrel has to look, right? Like if I'm looking at check aiming and we have a tank in the middle, I want the barrel to look at check aiming. So what we're going to do to make things easier is we're going to use a function in the vector3 called normalize. And what this does is this vector could be very large. And what we're going to do is we're going to compress it so all the values for x, y, and z are between 0 and 1. And it makes things a lot easier to work with. So when you get different axes and stuff, they're always going to be like normalized and much easier and nicer to work with. Okay. And then we're going to calculate our rotation. I'm just going to call it rot. And this is going to be, we're going to use some simple trigonometry. We're going to say and2. We're going to say diff.y and diff.x. We're going to times that by math.radians to degrees. So all these work within radians. So at the end, whenever you do like these trigonometry calculations, we're gonna convert it to degrees. Okay, and we're gonna use the tan one based on where the hypotenuse and that jazz is. Okay, so now that we got the rotation, we're gonna set last rotation. And like I said before, this last rotation is mainly for networking. Just to rotation, and then we're gonna say barrel pivot dot rotation is equal to quaternion dot Euler. So we're going to work in Euler, which is just standard vector numbers, your 3 numbers you see inside the transform, whereas quaternion actually has 4 numbers. And we're going to say 0, and we're going to work on the z-axis. We're going to say rot plus barrel pivot offset. Okay, beautiful. Okay, so while we're doing this here, because we have the last position, this is going to be used when we're doing networking updates. So we're going to have access to get the last rotation. And we're just going to return last rotation. And then another one for when it's not our player, but we're setting the version of player 2 or player 3 or whatever on our server, on our local client, we're going to have one called set rotation. And it's going to take in a float, or it's going to be a val. And what we're going to do is we're going to say that the barrel pivot dot rotation is equal to quaternion dot Euler, and this value is, it's going to work the same as the rot before. So we're going to say valued plus the barrel pivot offset. Beautiful. And like I said, these will be used in the future. It's to handle with the networking. Okay. Now, so now if we go into our game, and because this, well, I'm just going to turn this prefab off because we're working on it right now. but it does need a barrel pivot. So I'm going to turn it back on. I'm going to feed in the pivot. Make sure you hit apply so it actually applies to the left one over here. Then I'm going to turn it off. Okay, beautiful. We're going to hit play. And you'll notice that the barrel now rotates. And if we still move, it's still moving like we did before. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to be able to kind of do what a tank does. So a tank rotates and then kind of moves back and forth, right? So the way we're going to do that is we're going to go back into Player Manager, and you're going to go down to your check movement script. So we currently get a horizontal, which is your A or D, and then we get a vertical, which is W and S. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify the position and we're going to modify the rotation. So the first thing we're going to do is the position. So let's say, based on how the graphics are, if I turn back on the player prefab, the guy is facing down, okay? So vector 3 gives us vector 3 dot up, which would be this direction. And because I'm facing the other way, I'm going to use negative up, which would be down. So we're going to just kind of get rid of this. We're going to get rid of this little vector, and we're going to say negative transform. So that's the transform of our tank. And we're going to say dot up. So like I was saying before, because we're facing downward, we need to use the opposite of up, which is negative up. And we're going to times that by vertical, and then times that by speed, and time dot delta, so it's nice and smooth. Okay, cool. So now if I was to play vertical, it would only go up and down and not horizontal. So horizontal is going to be rotation. So we're going to say transform, and we're going to use a function transform called rotate. And we don't use rotate here because this is a precise calculation, whereas this one is, as I'm kind of holding the key, rotate over time sort of thing. So we're going to use the rotate, and we're going to say a new vector 3, and it's the same as rotation down below where it is the Z, and we're going to say negative horizontal, and again it's because the direction of our tank and stuff. We're going to say negative horizontal times rotation, that's the value that we set up to 60 at the top, and then times time dot delta time. Okay, cool. And if we go back to the game, and we wait for this to load, I'm just going to turn off the player prefab. I'm going to launch into the game. And as I move forward, up and down, he goes back, and as I rotate, he rotates. So now if I drive forward and I rotate, I now start going in a circle. And like I was saying before, you can play around with the speed, and you can play around with the rotation values. It is totally up to you. But now we got the barrel looking where our mouse is, and our tank goes based on where WASDA is. Beautiful. So I'm going to, now that that is working, I'm just going to delete the player prefab from here. Okay. And now we're going to start updating this for other clients. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the server, and we're going to start with adding in a new event. So we're going to have a socket on, and we're going to have an event called update rotation. Now you might say, hey, why don't you just put this in the update position? This is all to do with the tank and stuff. And the reason behind this is because we might use update position for things like bullets. So position is just X and Y, and if we can keep a networking command that's just X and Y, we can update littler things that only rely on X and Y and not rotation values with just that command. So we're going to use a custom one called update rotation, and we're going to say it gives us some data, and we're going to say player dot, and now we need some values. So if you open up the player class, we're going to add two values below here. We're going to say this dot tank rotation. So this is that rotation, the tank, the horizontal keys. We're going to say equals a new number, and it's much easier when you're working with numbers that you're using this number-based class, and I'm going to initialize it to 0. Otherwise, it will kind of convert it to a string and stuff, and it gets really messy, and Just much easier if you remember. If you're kind of working with numbers, just always kind of use the new number class. Okay, so I'm going to say new number, and I'm going to initialize that to 0 as well. So now if we go back to index.js, we can now say player.tankRotation. So player.tankRotation is going to be equal to, and the data that we're going to pass is also going to have tank rotation. And we're going to say player.barrelRotation is equal to data.barrelRotation. And this is going to look very similar to the position, and it very much is, just we're only sending so much data. We're going to say broadcast.emit, and we're going to emit the same event for us on other clients. And we're just going to pass ourselves through. For now, like I was saying before, if you want to optimize this data, we could create a little JSON object that has just the ID and just the data we're sending, and we'll be doing that in the future. For now, we're just going to be sending player so it looks nice and smooth. Okay, so make sure you save that on the server. You should see that it restarts. The server restarted. And let's start creating some events. So what we need to do is we need to, on the client, we need to create a network rotation. So the network rotation is going to work very similar to the network transform, and in the future you could combine these two classes, or you could create a base class that takes away a lot of the functionality that you're going to see repeated. For now, to keep it simplistic, we're going to do a lot of copying, and it's going to look very similar. So we're going to create inside the networking folder, we're going to say network rotation. And we're going to open that guy up. And make sure you change the namespace .networking. And we're going to kind of copy and paste stuff from the network rotation. So I'm going to type it all back out because it's a lot easier. But I'll kind of show you that it's basically the same. So for example, we like the require component of the network identity. And we're going to want some referenced values. So I'm going to copy this guy, and we're going to start typing from here. So I'm going to make a header, and this is where it's going to be a little different because we're going to have a couple values. We're going to say referenced values. I'm going to paste that in just because I don't want to type it out. And then make sure you hit the control period so you get the little IntelliSys to bring in the namespace. And we're going to say private float old tank rotation. So just like the network transform, where it kind of has like the old transform and compares it to see if it has to send data, we're going to do the same thing with the rotation of the tank and the rotation of the barrel. So it'll be a little bit different. And then we're also, for this, because the rotation is stored in Player Manager, we need reference to the Player Manager. So we're going to say header class references. It's going to be a serializable field, and we'll say private Player Manager, and then make sure you do control period again, bring in that namespace, and then we're going to say Player Manager. And then we're going to bring in the network identity because it's required at the top, so we're going to handle getting that ourselves. We're going to want a new class called player rotation. So player rotation doesn't exist, and we're going to create that inside network client. So if you go over to network client, and then again at the bottom where we kind of have these serializable classes that can be sent over the network, we're going to create a new one. We're going to call this public class player rotation. And we're going to put in a public float, and we're going to say tank rotation and make sure that's lowercase. I'm going to say public float barrel rotation, and then save that. Okay, so go back to network rotation, and now you should see that it is indeed green now. And we're just going to say that that is player. And the reason why we're doing that is just because we can kind of copy stuff from network transform. Makes it a little bit easier. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab reference to the network identity. So we're going to say network identity is equal to get component of that class. Okay. And then just like the network transform, we're going to say player is equal to, and then we're going to use player rotation this time. And we'll set the defaults to 0 for the barrel and the tank. And then we're going to do this little, if we don't have a network identity, so basically if we're not controlling this script, we can say that we can just turn it off. Okay. And then we're going to go into the update function. So this is going to look very similar like I was saying before, just a couple changes. We're going to say network identity dot is controlling. And then we're going to say if old tank rotation is not equal to transform dot local Euler angles dot z. So remember, we're working on the z axis for angles. And then basically, so if the old tank rotation has changed or the barrel rotation has changed, we have to send a packet. So we're going to say or barrel rotation is not equal to, and the reason why we grab the player manager is because it's a little bit easier just to grab get last rotation. Okay, so if tank or barrel basically has changed, we're going to make sure that we set that stuff to the new versions of it. And we'll say old barrel is equal to player manager dot get last rotation. Beautiful. And then remember, we had a counter up the top. We actually didn't add the counter. So make sure you add the counter. I'm going to say private float still counter. And this is like before, that if you just kind of sat there and didn't move, that we want to make sure we are telling the server every so often that, hey, you know what, we're still here, like, don't worry about us. And then we're going to hit send data, and that doesn't exist yet. So come down here, say private void send data. Okay, cool. And then just like network transform, else still counter is plus equal to time dot delta time. So we're going to count the time. And then we're going to do our check that if it's been longer than a second, we'll send a rotational packet, just in case, so the server knows we're there. And we'll hit send data. Beautiful. So if we're moving, it won't count, and if we're standing still, it'll count every second it'll send. Okay, so just like the network transform before, we're going to say player.tank rotation is equal to transform dot local Euler angles dot z. And before, if we open up the network transform here, we have this nice, or I guess not so nice, calculation for doing 2 decimal places. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this as a method extension of the float class. So we're going to open up our method extension class. That's under utility. And right now we just have the player remove quotes. And we're going to add a new one. So I like to have one class and it just kind of has method extensions for kind of any type. Like that one's a string and this one's going to be float. And I'm just going to call it 2 decimals. And basically it's going to do this same math but in like a nice way. A nice line that's easy to read and doesn't have all this weird nonsense to it. So we're going to say return mathf dot round. We're going to say value times 1000 decimal f. And then we're going to divide by 1000 decimal f. Okay, beautiful. And if you go back to network rotation, now we can say transform local Euler angles dot z dot 2 decimals. And it won't show right now, but if you go over it and then do control period like before and you bring in the namespace of utility, we now have access to that. And then we can say player dot barrel rotation is equal to player manager dot get last rotation, and then we'll do the same. And just like before, like if you send too many too many decimal places, then sometimes the networking will get messed up. So it's just nice to kind of like round it, get it a couple decimal places, and do that. Okay, so we're going to say network identity, and we're going to get the socket to send the event. We're going to say .emit, and this one was update rotation. And we're going to say new JSON object, and inside there we're going to say JSON utility dot to JSON, and we're going to pass in player. So this is nothing new. This is very similar to the movement, just a couple modifies to it. And you can actually go to your transform here, and we can also change that. So if you want to change this to the 2 decimal method, you can just copy out the transform position X, and we'll put .2 decimals. And you'll notice I put it in lowercase, and if I do the control period, it'll still bring it in and change it for me, which is beautiful. And then I'm going to just copy this and paste, and make sure you change this to Y, otherwise it's not going to work. Okay, so now we have a network rotation class. We need to go to Unity, click the player prefab, and add. Once it loads, we'll do network rotation, and you'll see we get the grayed out values like we did before, and we'll just bring in player manager. Okay, beautiful. So now if you hit play, we can rotate to our mouse. We can move forward and rotate with our horizontal keys, so we can move. But we want to see another player, right? So when we did the events, we set the event up on the server. We transformed the data via the player, and now the last thing we have to do is handle the event for other players sending it to us. So if you go back to network client, we have update position, and we're going to add a new event called update rotation. So we're going to say on update rotation, and it's going to have a parameter of E, and it's going to be an arrow inline function. And okay, so we're going to bring over the ID, right? And then we're going to bring over the tank rotation. So we're going to say float tank rotation is equal to E dot data, and we called it tank rotation. And then we're going to grab it as a number, so we're going to say dot F. And then I'm going to just, so I'm holding down shift and using the arrow keys to highlight this whole line, but it's up to you how you do it. And we're going to rename this to barrel rotation. And barrel rotation here. Beautiful. Just like before, we're going to grab the network identity based on the mapped index to the dictionary. And what we're going to do is we're going to say the network identity dot transform dot local Euler angles is equal to a new vector 3 0 0, because we're dealing with the z-axis, the tank rotation. So just like how we set the tank rotation before in our script, we can set it here for the other components. And then for this one, we need to grab our player manager. And in player manager, we actually say player manager. We'll make sure we do control period there and bring in that namespace. And we had another function called set rotation, and that will be equal to barrel rotation. There we go. Okay, so now we've done the three things. We've made the event work on the R side. We sent the data to the server. The server can handle the data, and then it gets transmitted back to our client through here to update others that are not ourselves. Okay, so if I come into here and I hit play, let's give that a second. Okay, so we have one tank, rotates, moves forward, and rotates. So let's add a second player. So I'm going to start up my symbol link version, and you'll notice that the player starts. So I'm on the other player's screen. I'm rotating my mouse. I'm going to rotate the tank. I'm going to go forward. I'm going to go back. And you'll notice that the trail just kind of handles itself automatically, which is really, really handy. It has a little bit of a smaller trail for some reason. And then we're going to switch over to our client. You can see my mouse and me rotating it, and everything is working. So the next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be shooting, and then after that we're going to be handling collision with the bullets. So shooting involves a lot of things that have to happen on the server side. Okay, so we're going to fire event from the client, and then everything's going to happen on the server and update to everybody's client. So that's going to be part 5. We'll be shooting. Hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. Make sure you guys give a follow, give a subscribe. Go check my Discord, go check my Twitter down below. If you guys really like it, make sure you leave comments. They're really helpful to keep me going, and these will now be bi-weekly, these tutorials, so you guys don't have to wait a month. And yeah, so thank you for coming into the tutorial, and now you get to see a little bit more graphical stuff, and we'll start having a game soon, so it'll be nice and fun. Anyways, thank you guys. Make sure you guys subscribe, like, comment on this bad boy, and I'll see you guys next time for part 5.